This Week in Richmond is made possible in part by Dignity Memorial, caring for our communities with a network of funeral homes and cemeteries in Virginia and throughout North America. More information about Dignity Memorial's providers is online at dignitymemorial.com.
Alpha Natural Resources. Consistent with its running right process, Alpha is an energy company committed to being a leader in mine safety and an environmental steward. We fuel progress around the world. More information at alphanr.com.
Haley Buick GMC, the place for a new Verano or Terrain Denali, on Midlothian Turnpike in Richmond and online at haleybuickgmc.com. Taking it to the streets and helping our community. The Virginia Chamber of Commerce, the voice of the Virginia business community, working in legislative, regulatory, and political arenas to promote the free enterprise system. Information at vachamber.com.
I just received a letter from a student who thanked me for instilling the love of math in him. That's why I teach.
Brought to you by the Virginia Education Association, because a good education is good for everybody.
Additional support is provided by these sponsors. And by the members of Virginia's public television stations. Thank you.
Welcome to This Week in Richmond, and a very special welcome to Mark Earley. Appreciate very much your being on This Week in Richmond.
Hey, it's my pleasure.
From your time serving in the Senate from 1988 through 1998, and then 4 years as Attorney General of Virginia, running for governor, but then after that election, going to work in prison ministries for a decade. Now back in private practice where you started after law school.
You're making me tired.
and of recent, coming to Richmond, in fact, we'll tell our viewers that the day we're having this conversation is the day that the governor's convening the first meeting of a commission of 27 people to look at issues pertaining to parole.
Correct.
And I'll also tell our viewers that if they haven't kept up with your career and your perspectives, that way back in 2008, you were here in Richmond speaking at the Commonwealth Prayer Breakfast. And I went back to make sure my memory was correct from that time, but you indicated then that your mind had changed some on certain issues pertaining to parole. That might even be a good place to start to talk about the prison ministry and how that did cause your mind to change on some matters.
Sure. Well, you know, when I had the privilege of serving here in the Senate from 1987 to 1997, during that decade all over the nation, America was getting tough on crime.
Right.
And Virginia, like a lot of other states, took a number of proactive steps. We abolished parole. We instituted 3 strikes and you're out. We instituted truth in sentencing. We lowered the age at which juveniles could be tried as adults from 16 to 14. We increased the number of minimum mandatory sentences across the board for various kinds of crimes. And we built a lot of new prisons here in Virginia. And that was not unlike what was going on across the country. And, you know, at the time we were responding to a very significant high spike in crime, not only in Virginia, but across the country. And so after I served here and was in the Attorney General's office and was out of government, I was president and CEO of Prison Fellowship for 10 years and had the opportunity to visit all across the nation our prisons. And you know, one of the things I realized is that all of those things that we had done, however well-intentioned and however good they may have been and still be, what we had done was really increase the number of people behind bars in the United States. We have over 2 million individuals today behind bars. That's more per capita than any nation in the world, except maybe North Korea. We don't have their numbers. They're so dark. But that caused me to begin to step back and say, well, were all of the things we did at the time necessary to do in quite the way we did them? And if so, or if not, do they need some modification going forward?
So in that time period, in fact, I wrote down a quote that you said at the breakfast. You said, "For the first 48 years of my life, I did not think much about prisoners. If I ever did think about them, I thought, I'm glad I'm not one. And the longer they are where they are, so much the better."
Right. Well, I'm still glad I'm not one.
Yes.
I'm not sure I would agree with the second part of that statement, and that is the longer they are where they are, the better off we all are. That depends on the individual. One of the things I saw when I traveled around the country visiting prisons is that so many of the people in prison are there for nonviolent offenses, and an awful lot of them for drug crimes, and an awful lot of people who have dual diagnosis with substance abuse and also intellectual disabilities. Prison is not a good place for those individuals. You know, there are some people who are predators who need to be in prison and need to be there long term. Some even need to be segregated from other prisoners. They're so violent and dangerous. But the vast majority of people in prison are coming out. Even without parole, they're coming out. The average sentence in the United States is, I think, 4 years. So most people are coming back, and the question is, are they going to be coming back prepared to reenter society as a law-abiding citizen, or perhaps more in tune with the ways of criminal behavior, which is not what we want?
You know, recent governors, both parties, have really worked on restoration of rights. While that's not a part of what you all will be studying, I think, in that commission, you have any reflections and comments on the move that's been here in Virginia and maybe across the country to try to restore rights to people who've served their time and are released from prison?
Yeah, I think it's a good idea. I think once someone has served their time in prison, they've served their debt to society, they've gotten out, and they have finished their probation and parole. I don't see any reason at that time to punish them further. They've done what society imposed upon them as a hopefully fair and just punishment. So, for example, I think people who've served prison, gotten out, gotten off parole and probation ought to have the right to vote back. Really no questions asked.
You know, I think things progress at times slower in Virginia than in other states. And I think some states it is almost an automatic, it may be automatic. I think it's still not quite that fast here in Virginia, but I think that certainly the last few governors have been working to try to streamline the process as much as they could.
Right, I think so. I think Governor Kane, Governor McDonnell, and now Governor McAuliffe have all tried to speed up the process of having people who are applying to have their civil rights restored review those in a much more expeditious fashion. Years ago, you know, you would apply and either be outright denied, or it would go into a black hole and you'd never hear anything, or it would be a long time. So I happen to believe that, for example, someone's voting rights ought to be restored, you know, right away when they're finished with their parole and probation.
The 10 years you had serving there as president and CEO and in the prison ministry, what other reflections do you have on that time period in your life?
Well, I think as I went in and out of prisons, it was a constant reminder, you know, there but for the grace of God go I. There's a very small degree of separation between those of us who are not in prison and people who are. Different family background, different set of friends in high school or college, being prone to addiction-type behaviors. It's just, you know, it doesn't take much today to wind up on the other side of the law, and particularly when you realize so much of it's fueled by alcohol and drug addiction. So, you know, all of us have things we deal with. I'm happy I've never dealt with those, but there are many, many people who do. And, you know, I think if we can divert those people into getting some help, prison ought to be, you know, a last resort. So I think I saw how easy it is for someone to wind up in prison who's not really a bad person. They're not a predator. They're not violent. But they have a hard time controlling their behavior when it comes to drug and alcohol.
You know, just very recently, and this is not intended to be a confession, but just very recently I was in General District Court on a minor traffic matter. I waited a couple of hours until a chance to approach the judge. And I was struck by the number of young people, and I'm not sure of their age, if they were 18 or 19, or if they were even younger than that the offenses were nonviolent. Some of them, most of them, appeared had to have an attorney appointed to represent them. And I was somewhat saddened by that, and I was thinking it had been too long since I'd spent time sitting in court and observing. I have done that before, and I was thinking that would probably be something good for others of us to do at times, and to see the ones that are there. Not that they shouldn't have been given a ticket or even arrested, but some very sad circumstances.
Well, I think in a very similar fashion, it's a really good point. You know, when I served in the Senate from 1987 to 97, you know, with most of my colleagues, we were making laws about who was going to go to prison for how long, whether or not they were going to be let out on parole. Yet we had very little knowledge of the institutions that were going to hold these people, that we were making decisions that would send so many there. So, you know, a significant change in my behavior, which I would call sort of a balancing of how I viewed the criminal justice system, was spending a lot of time in prisons, you know, both in Virginia and across the nation. That didn't happen when I was in the Senate or Attorney General. You know, if you're in the Senate or the House of Delegates here, you occasionally get a tour of a prison, but it's a very antiseptic tour, and you don't really see and get the smell and the feel and the gut emotion of what's going on day to day. You don't see how many prisoners are in segregation who have mental health problems. You don't see how many prisoners who are dealt with by basically medicating them, who are sleeping 12 to 18 hours a day. You don't see the lack of programs that would allow someone to get their education or rehabilitation. The programs are there, but they're not there in the kind of quantity and access that we need. So I think, you know, just as you had kind of a wake-up call going into General District Court, I think for a lot of senators, a lot of public officials, whether you're, you know, at the city council level or the Congress, you really do need to go into the local jails and the prisons, particularly when you realize that 1 out of every 100 adults are now today behind bars in the United States.
So 1 out of 100?
Right. And the numbers of incarceration in America are particularly disturbing when you look at minorities. Those numbers in the minority community, particularly in the African American community between the ages of 18 and 29, the percentage of young adult African American males that are incarcerated is staggering. And it's really destroying communities across the country. And it has a generational impact. One of the things we saw when I was at Prison Fellowship is really the greatest predictor of whether a child ends up in prison is not the color of their skin, the neighborhood they grew up in, their educational level. It's whether or not they had a mother or father in prison. And so if you have high numbers of males in a community going to prison, my dad's in prison, it's having a generational impact that is something we don't want to live with in the future. So I'm glad we're taking a look at how we might be able to do things better here in Virginia and hopefully around the nation.
You know, it appears around the nation that there's a renewed emphasis at, while not legalizing certain drugs, but trying to decriminalize them in some ways. And I'll mention one other observation from that day in court. A person who did not show up, but who had someone there of counsel who let the judge know that he would have been there on his traffic offense, whatever it was, suspended license, but he was taken to the jail and to be processed, and there they found a small amount of marijuana in the pocket, and now he will be going to circuit court. They were saying that he has a criminal charge against him, and so he wouldn't be coming back to there to deal with the traffic issue. I'm not in any way suggesting that just wink and turn away and not look at someone who would be using a substance that's illegal, but while there were those of us in the 90s and 80s and other times that had other perspectives on some of those same drugs, I think that just a warehouse, particularly young adults, it's kind of a scary thing.
It is, and I do think, I will say this, I don't think many people realize this, that really for many, many years now in Virginia and across the nation, in most states, first offense marijuana has really been, in all practical effects, decriminalized, in the sense that you will be arrested, but if it's your first offense, it's basically taken under advisement by the court. You do 24 hours of community service. You do lose your license to drive for 6 months. But at the end of 12 months, if you have no further violations of the law, and in particular no further drug offenses, it's going to be dismissed. So on marijuana, people in Virginia and in most states have really had one bite at the apple for a long time. And even people who have done that and then come back a second or third time, you know, a marijuana possession is only punishable by 30 days in jail. So I see very little people getting jail time for marijuana in Virginia, and I'm in the courts every day. What we see really, the kinds of people that end up in jail today in Virginia and across the nation for drugs are people who become addicted to prescription pain pills or are addicted to cocaine, heroin, or some other Schedule I or II drug. And even on those, the first offense can be taken under advisement if it's a small possession charge and dismissed after a certain period of time. But if someone has a chronic addiction, they're going to be back. And so you have these individuals coming back 2 and 3 and 4 times who are abusing Schedule I, Schedule II, Schedule III prescription narcotics or cocaine or heroin. They're addicts. And we don't really have a comprehensive system of treatment in place across the nation that's very good at helping these individuals avoid prison.
Right.
And so we see a lot of people who have a cocaine, who have a prescription addiction or a heroin addiction, which is a very deadly addiction these days. We see them come back and back because they can't seem to break the cycle, and it's extremely difficult to deal with.
What's your perspective on drug courts? You say you're in and out of court, and I think from what I understand, it's kind of across the state. It's a patchwork. There are not drug courts in every region, but I have heard that where they are, they can sometimes be very helpful.
I think they can be. You know, I've lived in Loudoun for the last 10 years and been practicing law there now for the last 4. And Loudoun had a drug court until a couple of years ago. And basically what happened was it gave somebody who was on probation for drugs, who was headed to jail, it gave them a chance to participate in a program of what can best be described as intensive supervision. So it was a good program. It did not have high success rates. I remember sitting in on the drug court a number of times and thinking, I'm not sure I could live with this level of scrutiny in my life. You know, if you were literally a minute late for an appointment, you had to write a large essay. You had to keep a journal in 15-minute increments or hour increments of what you were doing with your time. Now, all of those things are good to do, but it was a extremely regimented, structured program. And some people, it worked. It was a great program. But for other people, it was just, you know, if you're an addict and have addictive behavior, you can't always go from that behavior to basically a military-style perspective in terms of time and activities and structure. And a lot of times, you know, you've burnt some bridges in terms of getting employment, which is another thing that the program was very serious about. So I do think drug courts are good. It's just a question of kind of what's the kind of treatment, what's the kind of opportunities given to people who are addicted that help them break the cycle. And I'm no expert in that.
Right.
You know, what works for somebody doesn't work for somebody else.
So are there other ways that maybe your mind has changed some, death penalty or other matters that you see differently than when you did, say, when you were in the state Senate?
Well, the death penalty is one. I recently wrote an article for the University of Richmond Law Review saying how my mind had changed about the death penalty. And, you know, I was someone when I was in the Senate that was a supporter of the death penalty, and as Attorney General, we had 35 executions in Virginia during the time I was Attorney General. But also, over the last 20 years, we've just seen so many people who have actually been convicted of capital murder have their sentences overturned, either because of faulty eyewitness identification, faulty forensic testing. We didn't have good DNA at the time. Now we have it, and they're exonerated. And it really sort of shook my world a little bit, because when I was in the Senate and Attorney General, I sort of took some refuge in my pro-position of the death penalty, in the sense that, well, I couldn't find a case where someone had been put to death wrongly, and was pretty convinced we could get it right at the end of the day. I'm no longer convinced of that. We've had, I think, 153 exonerations of people across the United States who were on death row. And the straw that broke the camel's back for me was actually an old case in South Carolina of a 14-year-old boy named Charles Stinney. He was an African-American young man who was literally put to death within 90 days of the alleged crime. The conviction was based on his confession at 14 years old, which psychiatrists going back and looking at the case said was clearly not a reliable confession. The jury trial lasted a day. His attorney called no witnesses to the stand. No appeal was filed, and he was put to death 60 days later. The accounts were he was so small and frail that the bracelets they put around for execution wouldn't stay around his ankles. And the court in South Carolina ruled in December of this year, this is a case in the 1940s, they basically reversed his case and found, that there was not sufficient evidence to find him guilty. And that case kind of broke my heart. And, there's no question those kinds of cases have been repeated decades ago, and it's hard to go back and pull them out of the cobwebs now. This one was, and I think it was just the straw that broke the camel's back for me. If we have a predator, we can keep them in prison for life. We can keep them segregated. We can keep them from harming other inmates, other guards. But I'm no longer convinced that government gets it right all the time when it comes to the death penalty. And in my opinion, in my view, you can't have the death penalty unless you're assured of having 100% correctness every time. Because we've always held in our judicial system in America, and really the whole Anglo-Saxon jurisprudence system going back to the Magna Carta, that it's better than 10 people go free than 10 guilty people go free than one innocent man be found guilty and imprisoned. And you just can't have a death penalty if you're having innocents put to death.
So the practice of law you find rewarding now from all of those experiences?
I do. I always have. I practiced law from 1982 through when I was Attorney General, and then I had a bit of a break when I was President and CEO of Prison Fellowship for 10 years. But I'm enjoying being back in the practice of law and being in the courtroom, and I'm loving it and enjoy every day of it.
Well, the governor has quite a charge to the 27 of you in his executive order, because I think he's expecting a preliminary report in November and a complete one in December. And as I've looked over all of the issues that you're charged with, that you and your colleagues, I'm sure after the first meeting we'll be having multiple time spent to try to deal with those 5 different issues. We have another closing minute or so. You optimistic about some positive outcomes from this review?
Well, I applaud the governor. I think any time a legislative body takes a significant action that affects a lot of people's lives, like we did when we abolished parole, it only makes sense 10, 20, 25 years later to stop and look back and say, okay, why did we do what we did at the time? Has it worked, and does it need any modification? And I think it's a really smart thing for people in government to take a look at past decisions and reevaluate them in terms of what we've learned, and maybe what we didn't know then that we know now, and maybe some things we knew then that we still know now. So I think it's a good move, and I'm looking forward hopefully to providing some good constructive feedback to the governor and the legislature.
Well, Secretary of Public Safety and Homeland Security Brian Moran has been on our program recently, Secretary of the Commonwealth. LeVar Stoney has, and the two of them, along with you, are the three co-chairs that the governor's named. So thank you very much for being on This Week in Richmond.
Thank you, Dave. It's good to be back.
Before you have this time of service, and we look forward to talking with you when it's completed.
My pleasure. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
This Week in Richmond is made possible in part by Dignity Memorial, caring for our communities with a network of funeral homes and cemeteries in Virginia and throughout North America. More information about Dignity Memorial's providers is online at dignitymemorial.com.
Alpha Natural Resources, a leader in mine safety and an environmental steward.
Haley Buick GMC in Richmond and online at haleybuickgmc.com. The Virginia Chamber of Commerce, the voice of the Virginia business community.
The Virginia Education Association, because a good education is good for everybody.
Additional support is provided by these sponsors. And by the members of Virginia's public television stations. Thank you.